Okay, today we're going to talk about quotations for your text analysis. So when you quote, first of all, for this essay, don't forget that you have to have at least 2 quotations. Also for this essay, please don't use quotes more than 4 lines long. Number one, this is a short essay, and so if you're using quotes that are more than 4 lines long, you're probably quoting a little too much. Your quotes are a little too long. And number two, quotes that are more than 4 lines long within your paper use a different format. And we're going to wait and talk about those kinds of quotes with our next paper. So just for this paper, if it runs more than 4 lines long in your paper, you need to try and shorten it and cut some of what you're using for that quote. Don't stuff your essay with quotations. You can use more than 2 if you would like, but 1 per body paragraph is more than enough. And by body paragraph, I mean you shouldn't have a quote in your introduction or in your conclusion, but if you want to have a quote for ethos and pathos and logos and goal and have 4 quotations, that's perfectly fine, as long as you're keeping them relatively short and as long as you're really integrating them within the paper, which we'll talk about in just a second. So the quoting format is on page, or it starts on page 31 in your Bridging the Difference book. But the main things you need to remember are a quote is word for the most part, and we'll talk about exceptions in just a second, and that you have to put quotation marks around your quotes. Other things you have to remember to do are to introduce and explain your quotes. So you want to set us up for the quote before you give it to us and then explain it to us after you've given it to us. So if you can see here this example where it says wrong, there's no introduction, there's no explanation. And I see lots of students do this in their essays. This is going to lose you major points. Why? Because it is completely wrong. This is not what quotes are meant to be used for. I've seen a lot of people do this before. I saw a lot of you do this in your My Generation papers, where you would give song lyrics, but you wouldn't tell me where they came from, and you wouldn't tell me what they had to do with what you were talking about in your paper. That's wrong, because I look at them and I'm like, what? Why are you doing this? I don't know. Don't assume that I understand why you're using any kind of quote or any kind of song lyrics or anything like that. This is the correct way to do it. Start with an introduction that explains who said the quote or wrote the quote. Then you'll give the quote itself. Then you'll explain, why are you using this quote? Now for this paper, that should be pretty easy because your quotes should always tie into what the goals are for your text, or ethos, pathos, or logos, one of those strategies that you have to talk about. So this example says, Lessig, that's our author's name, opens his essay by explaining his position that, quote, if piracy means using the creative property of others without their permission, then the history of the content industry is a history of piracy. And so that's our quote, and we have our page number that it came from right there. And then our explanation. This lets us know one of Lessig's goals for the essay, to convince us that piracy is nothing new. So we've got who said it, the quote itself, the page number, because we're dealing with essays here, and then an explanation of why am I including this in my essay. This is so important, this explanation here. This is the thing that students are most likely to skip, but it's really important and you're going to lose points if you're skipping that explanation. Now with your introduction, the easiest way to introduce a quote is to say who's saying it and then to give a signal word. So signal words are things like acknowledges, believes, explains, argues, proves. So you can use any of these words, but I want to caution you on 2 things. Number 1, don't use the same signal word over and over and over again. I get very tired of hearing so-and-so states 5 times in an essay. So maybe pick 2 or 3 of these and go back and forth between them. The other thing I want to caution you about is make sure that your quote is actually doing what the signal word says it's doing. So if the person is not arguing, don't use argues as your signal word. If the person is not implying something. Don't use implies. Just make sure that they're actually doing what you're saying they're doing. So again, introduce the quote, tell us who said it, and maybe you can start to tell us what it's about, or you can actually save that for the explanation, however you want to do it. There's a lot of different ways. Call the authors or the interviewees or whoever it is that you're quoting by their full name or only their last name. So if John Smith is our author, don't call him John. He didn't give you permission to call him by his first name. That's too informal. So you can either call him John Smith or Smith. Use page numbers after the quote, but before the period. So again, we're talking about essays right now. Because your essay, or if your essay is something you can hold in your hand, meaning it's from Out Loud or the Bridging the Difference book or a magazine or something like that, then you have page numbers and you have to use those page numbers. If you're dealing with an online essay, there's no page numbers and you don't have to worry about that. And we'll talk about that in a second with our documentaries. But if you do have a page number, include it after the quote. So to help you remember this, everything that's actually said in your essay needs to go in quotation marks. That page number is not said it's not part of the quote. It's not actually something that's said in the essay. So it doesn't go in the quotation marks, but you're not done with your quote until you've given your page number. So you've got to have your quote itself, which will end with the quotation marks. Then you'll have your page number. Then you're done with that sentence, done with that quote, so you can put your period. So hopefully that's a little tip that will help you remember where the parentheses actually go within your quote. And then once again, explain why you're using the quote. Is it about goals? Is it an example of ethos, pathos, or logos? And then go a step further and explain how. How is it showing the goal? Or if it's an example of ethos, pathos, or logos, how do you know? And we'll look at some examples later. So here's an example from Out Loud. When discussing how Rainbow Radio came about, Ed Madden explains that it was meant to showcase, quote, gay and lesbian voices from the Deep South, speaking from the particularities of experience in a culture that denies them legitimacy, exposing the public to voices within the LGBT community that are too often silenced, and to issues they deal with on a daily basis are the main goals of Out Loud. So here we have our introduction. So we're explaining what the quote is about and who is saying it. And then we have our quotation marks themselves with the quote in it. Then we have where it came from. It came from Out Loud. It came from this particular page. And the reason this page looks weird is because this is in the introduction, so it doesn't have actual page numbers yet. The introduction has Roman numerals. And then we've got our explanation here. So we've got all the things that we need. Now I want to point out this ... This is what we call an ellipses. Any idea why we use that? So you use ellipses to show when you've left words out. So this is going back to when I said a quote has to be word for word. It doesn't necessarily, because you can leave things out. So if you have a long sentence, or even, say you do an essay and you want to take something from one paragraph, but also from another paragraph later on, you can do that. All you have to do is put that little ... anywhere where you've left out words or sentences or even entire paragraphs. That's all you have to do, and you can still put that all together in one quote. Here's another example. One example of pathos in the essay Fighting the Lies of the Anti-Gay Right is when McEwen explains they taught all homosexuals to hate ourselves, to think of ourselves as sick. This is pathos because it's meant to make us imagine how awful it feels to be told you should hate yourself for who you are, so we can sympathize with the LGBT community. So here, again, we're explaining who has said this. Who's the author here? This is McEwen, is his last name. We've given the title of the essay it comes from. We've explained that this is an example of pathos. We have the quote itself, and the page number it comes from. And then we have an explanation. So notice this doesn't just say this is pathos, it explains why. Well, because here's what it's meant to make us feel. It's meant to make us feel bad uh, for people within this community that are told they should hate themselves. So in your own essays, make sure you're not only explaining to me if the example you're giving is ethos, pathos, or logos, but also why. If it's pathos, tell me what I'm supposed to feel. Tell me what the author wants me to feel by using this example. Now notice I've also used brackets in here. So we talked about ellipses is used when you leave words out. Brackets are used when you need to change or add something. So in some cases, to clarify a quote, you might need to add words. In other cases, to make it fit grammatically correctly with the rest of your sentence, you'll have to change words. This is going to happen. So the only thing you have to do when you're changing or adding things is put brackets around what you're changing or adding. And so these ellipses and brackets, these are the two ways to kind of manipulate your quotes so that they fit properly into your paper in the way that you want them to. So don't forget how to use those. Quote within a quote, also called an indirect quote. So this is a tricky thing where within your essays or your documentaries, you might want to quote someone who's being interviewed by your author or your director. And that's okay, you can do that, but you want to clarify who is saying it and distinguish that person from the person who actually wrote the essay or the director. So here's an example, and this is talked about on page 35 in Bridging the Difference. What you want to do is introduce who actually said the quote, and then you'll put QTD in plus the author's last name in parentheses. So here's our example. From this book, Sway, by Ari Brafman, we have a guy named Alan Huffcutt who was interviewed, and he says this quote on page 86. So when we put it in our essay, we can say, in Chapter 2 of Sway, Professor Alan Huffcutt, who has studied job interviews for 20 years, explains, so we're giving the name of the person who actually said what we're quoting, and we're giving his credentials, because in an essay or in a documentary, when someone is quoted, it's almost always going to explain who that person is. And so you want to give those credentials so we know, well, if this isn't the author or the director, who is this person? So give us a little bit of explanation of who the person is. And then it says, explains how the job interview is one of the ways we engage in a version of diagnosis bias called the mirror effect. And so, yeah, here's this quote. We don't need to look at the whole thing, but all I want to do is point out that it explains who actually said the quote. But then down here it says QTD in Brafman, because Brafman is the author of the book. Huffcutt is the guy being interviewed. And then we give the page number. So this is what it should look like if you're doing this quote within a quote. It's pretty similar for a documentary. You'll make sure that we know who is actually saying the quote by doing the same thing, giving us the person's name, giving us the person's credentials, and the quote that the person says. But then you'll put the movie name here in parentheses. So that's the only difference between the way a quote within a quote works for an essay versus a documentary. All right, and I've got another example from an essay. So again, here is the author's name, here is the signal phrase, here's the quote itself using that ellipses, here's the page number, and then here's the explanation. This is tied to goals. So now what I want you to do for your first writing assignment for this lecture is I want you to pick a quote from out loud. Any quote from any essay doesn't matter. All I want you to do is introduce that quote. So remember what this involves. It involves saying who said the quote, whether that's an author or whether it's someone who's been interviewed. Giving the quote itself in correct MLA format, which means with the quotation marks around it and with the page number in there in parentheses, and then give an explanation as to why this quote is important. So I said you could use any quote from any essay, but please make sure you use a good quote. So don't just pick a sentence at random. Pick something that you can tie either to goals of that essay or the goal of the book out loud as a whole, or an example of ethos, pathos, or logos. Any of those are fine, but make sure you can give some kind of explanation that tells us why this quote is important. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and do that really quick, and then you can move on. So now we're going to switch to talking about documentaries. Really similar to quoting essays, but I did want to mention the small differences. So this time, you're not dealing with an author's name, you're dealing with the names of directors or actors or people being interviewed. And you can quote any of those people, and that's fine. Just make sure you tell us who is actually speaking. Once again, call them by their first and last name or only their last name. Don't call Brad Pitt Brad. You don't know him. He didn't say that was okay. He is Pitt or Brad Pitt. There's no page numbers this time, obviously. This is a documentary, so you won't have anything to put in parentheses. Same thing for if you're doing an essay online. If there's no page numbers, you just completely leave the parentheses out. You're still going to explain why you're using the quote and try to tie it back to goals or ethos, pathos, logos. So here's an example from our Boondocks episode. In this episode of the Boondocks, Huey Freeman says, quote, "Yes, the government conspires to put a lot of innocent black men in prison, but R. Kelly is not one of those men. You want to help R. Kelly? Then get some help for R. Kelly." End quote. This is an example of logos because Freeman is arguing logically about why the artist R. Kelly should be found guilty of having sexual relations with an underage girl. He uses intelligent reasoning to explain how the evidence proves the artist is guilty and that this is not an example of racism. So I've introduced that this is an episode of the Boondocks. Notice I've italicized the Boondocks because it's the name of a television show. I've given the character's name. His name is Huey Freeman. And then I've given says as my signal phrase. So all of this is the introduction. This is telling us where does this quote come from. Then I've got the quote itself with quotation marks around it. There's no page numbers because, again, this is a TV show. Then I've got my explanation of how this ties into my essay. Notice I'm calling him Freeman. He's a cartoon character, but I still don't want to call him Huey in my actual essay because that's too informal. So I'm going to call him by his last name, Freeman, and I'm explaining that this is an example of logos, but I'm also telling why. Well, because it's a logical argument. So again, this is what you want to do every time you use a quote within your own text analysis. So now we're going to watch a short video. This is a trailer for a movie, and then we're going to talk about how you could quote from that movie trailer, and then I'm going to have you do this on your own. So here's our first trailer. This is from the documentary Where in the World is Osama bin Laden?
From big budget action movies, it's that complicated global problems are best solved by one lonely guy. What are you going to be doing? We're going to go look for Osama bin Laden. Okay. If I'm going to find Osama, then I'm going to be traveling to some pretty scary places. This course is reality-based protection. Turn away from the grenade. Oh! How do I say, don't take me, take the cameraman? guy? I was wondering if we could ask you a question. No. Arcade with the door open? I got a tip on where to find his uncle, Mafusa Song. You wouldn't turn him in for the $25 million? But I'm a wanderlust! It's impossible. Mission is impossible. This is hardcore Taliban country. There's 21 guys here with guns.
When whoever's escorting us says, let's go, it means go now.
We ask every time, hey, you guys know where Osama's at? And they always point, get to know Osama. So that way. Where in the world is Osama bin Laden? This is a good moisturizer. It'll keep my hands really soft. Yeah. And do you know where I can find Osama bin Laden?
Alright, so we're going to use this trailer as our example. So let's say you were doing Where in the World is Osama bin Laden as your documentary. What you could do for quotations are some things like this. At the beginning of the documentary, Spurlock tells people, quote, "We're going to look for Osama bin Laden. This is one of the goals of the documentary." See how simple this is? All it is explaining where we're getting this quote from. This is from the beginning of the documentary. Who's saying it? Morgan Spurlock is the name of the director. He's also the guy who's doing everything in the movie. So he's the one who says this. This is the goal. The documentary's goal was to go look for Osama bin Laden. So you can see how simple it is to tie a quote from a movie into goals. Here's another example. When Spurlock looks at the camera and says, quote, "This is hardcore Taliban country," then shows all the people around him with guns, he wants us to know the danger he's in. This is an example of pathos because we are supposed to feel afraid for him. So again, it's saying who actually says it. Here's his quote. And here's how this ties into the essay. Well, this is an example of pathos. And it's explaining why. It's explaining what we're supposed to feel. And you could do this for lots of different things that we saw just from the trailer. So a movie trailer for your documentary is a really good place to get good quotes from, because that's what a trailer is for. It's meant to show you the best things that are going to happen in that movie or documentary. So if you're having trouble finding good quotes, this is a good example for how you can do that, is to look up the movie trailer. So that, and to kind of go off track for just a second and talk about ethos, pathos, and logos. We've got an example of pathos here. There are others here related to danger, related to how we're supposed to feel about the director going into this dangerous situation. There's a lot of patriotism in this movie that you're supposed to feel. Ethos. He's the one actually doing it. He actually goes to 7 different countries within the Middle East and does the research and talks to people. And so that's an example of ethos as well. So if your director is going out and actually doing things, the things himself and making himself an expert, that's a way to talk about ethos. Logos, he's gathering evidence, he's gathering testimony from people to try and find where Osama bin Laden is. So there's a lot of different ways that you can find ethos, pathos, and logos in your essays and in your documentaries. Now for our last example, we're going to watch one more movie trailer. And so this is Super Size Me.
Hello, may I help you?
Yeah, can I get the double quarter pounder with cheese meal? I think I'm gonna have to go supersize.
It's hard for me to watch him go through this. It seems like you're starting to get addicted to it now.
You saw these numbers, right? These numbers are outrageous.
Unfortunately, you caused some major harm to your heart, your liver, your blood.
You're gonna die. You'll die. I want more. You gotta stop me. Supersize the American way. Getting fat, getting broke, either way you're gonna pay. Supersize me. Supersize it up. Supersize me. Make it bacon. Supersize me. Supersize me. Supersize me.
All right, so this leads in to your final writing assignment. So you're going to make a quote from a documentary now. Just like you did with Out Loud, now you're going to do this for Supersize Me. And I've given you a list here of different quotes that you can choose from that were all in that trailer that we watched. What I want you to do is introduce the quote by explaining who says it. And you don't have to have their actual names because I've given you who they all are in relation to Morgan Spurlock, the director, who's doing the experiment. So you can just use the label that I've given you to explain who's saying it. And then, of course, you want to have the quote itself in quotation marks. And then you want to explain why this quote is important, which again is often going to be either tying it directly back to goals, the goals of this particular documentary, or to examples of ethos, pathos, or logos. So, and again, not just tying it to those three strategies, but explaining how is it an example of those strategies. So, again, you'll do that with one of these quotes, and then that is your second writing assignment. So, once you're done with this, you will have done your own quote in hopefully correct MLA format for both an essay and a documentary. So you'll bring these in our next class period. We'll talk about them a little bit. We'll make sure that you understand them and did them correctly. And that's going to help you when you sit down to find quotes for your text analysis and to integrate them into your own essay. All right, so email me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you in class.